Hey there everybody, Mr. Lewis here again, ready to kick off Unit 6 in AP HuG today, which is titled Political Geography. And some people refer to this as geopolitics. Really, we're going to look at all the different borders and boundaries around the world, what separates and distinguishes one country from another, or one nation of people from another nation of people, and how those boundaries and borders can be shaped and shifted and changed over time. So we're going to look at some introductory notes today, and then at the end of the notes, I'm going to ask you to watch a very brief video that's in the Google Slides, and then complete a Q&A activity to go with that video. So let's dive into it. So Unit 6 is really interesting because we get to look at things like who determines a nation's leaders and laws, who determines the borders and boundaries that separate nations and establish new states? What resources do various nations control and how do they benefit from those resources? And of course, how does conflict come into play? And so we're going to look at all of these things and more throughout Unit 6. But just to sort of dip our toes into the waters of political geography, we're first going to take a look at Russia. Russia is a very unique example of political geography because they've gone from imperialism to communism to federalism to all kinds of various examples of political geography, not just in the way they run their government and their country and establish laws and elect leaders, but also the way they've changed their borders throughout time. So Russia from the early 1700s to the early 1900s was an empire. They were constantly pushing their boundaries and expanding the territory of the Russian Empire. They were also a monarchy, right? All the glitz and glamour of a king and queen and a royal family. But then there was a civil war. Toward the end of World War I, a civil war broke out in Russia that eventually turned the country into the Soviet Union, a communist nation known simply as the USSR. And that existed for just about 70 years. It eventually crumbled. It devolved, as we say, not revolution, but devolution is the process the Soviet Union went through, and broke up into many distinct sovereign nations. Today, Russia is a federation. And even today, we still see Russia pushing the boundaries of political borders. And we see this not just in the Ukraine, which is very close to Russia, but also in the icy cold Arctic Circle. And we're going to look at both of those examples. So this video is interesting. Here in this video, we can see the changes that have occurred in terms of political geography throughout Europe, which is what we see here, and parts of Asia, and then of course up into Russia over time. And this is just at the turn of the millennium, so going from the BC years into the AD years. And what we're going to see early on here is the dominance of the Roman Empire. And so all of this red territory is the Roman Empire. And what we see is, as these boundaries are changing, changes in political geography. So anytime a border shifts or is redrawn, this is some type of change in political geography. Political geography can mean a lot of different things. It's not just about elections and political parties and what type of government is in place, but also the boundaries and borders that surround that government and those nations of people. So as we get into, we're going to jump forward here, the early part of the 1300s, there we go, you can see that we're starting to get some of the countries in Europe that we have today. We can see France starting to develop, England, Hungary, Poland. But many of these are going to change, and these borders throughout the years constantly are shifting and reshaping through conflict, through nations developing into states, fracturing into multiple states, all kinds of processes taking place. But eventually, we have the ethnic Rus who eventually established the country of Russia. And Russia becomes the Russian Empire and continues to expand throughout the 1700s and the 1800s. And that leads us up to eventually World War I. World War I is going to begin in 1914. And you can see what the map looks like in 1915 here, with the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire down here in Turkey, and Austria-Hungary, the German Empire. Well, toward the end of World War I, Russia breaks out into civil war. And by the end of World War I, Russia is now the USSR, a key change in the political geography of Europe. This eventually builds up to World War II, and we can see smack dab in the middle of World War II here, 1942, another example of political geography constantly shifting the landscape of Europe as Nazi Germany continued to expand their territory. So eventually, Nazi Germany is wiped away by Allied forces, and the USSR continues to exist, but eventually, throughout the 80s, it's going to begin to crumble, and by 1991, no more Soviet Union. And all of these sovereign nations, these sovereign states, are developed as a result. Okay, and you can see them in the form of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, among others. Now, there's a key territory down here in Ukraine, not just because it borders Russia in the east, but also this little peninsula down here called the Crimean Peninsula, Crimea. Well, what's going to happen over the next few years as we turn the corner into the more modern period? In 2012, the European Union tried to bring Ukraine into its ranks, into the EU for trade and economic advantages, among other things. The Ukrainian president said no, and Ukrainian people didn't like this too much. They wanted to become more integrated with the EU, and because of this, protests erupted. And in the middle of this chaos, the president of Ukraine was forced to flee, and in 2014, amid this chaos, Russia invades Ukraine. Not just in the eastern portion of Ukraine, which bumps right up next to Russia, although they did invade there too, but they also annexed the Crimean Peninsula that I was just pointing out on the map. So Russia invaded a sovereign territory and laid claim to land that had belonged to Ukraine. So this is political geography at play. Whose territory is this? Who determines that? Does war determine that? Does Ukraine simply say, okay, this is yours now? That's probably unlikely, right? And unfortunately, this is not a happy ending, and we really don't have an ending yet. All we know at this point is that we've seen tens of thousands of deaths, many of them civilians, and millions of people displaced as a result. And this is the invasion of a sovereign territory. That's a big no-no in international law. But while some people insisted that the United States get involved in this conflict, many others insisted that we don't get involved. And so instead, we placed economic sanctions on Russia and tried to really damage their economy by not purchasing goods from Russia or convincing friends of ours around the world not to buy goods from Russia, not to purchase Russian exports. And in many ways, it did ding the Russian economy, but Russia continues to push the political boundaries. And we can see that not just in the Ukraine, and you can see that map here, this dark orange areas where some of the Russian forces pushed over the border into Ukraine, and down here in Crimea, the peninsula that was once Ukrainian sovereign territory and is now at risk of becoming Russian territory. This is an example of what we call irredentism here in eastern Ukraine. There are many people in eastern Ukraine who see themselves more as Russian than Ukrainian. They are ethnic Russians. They speak Russian, and they see themselves as Russian and very much supported Russia moving in and laying claim to some of this territory. This is what we call irredentism, when a country lays claim to an area based on cultural similarities, right? Based on ethnic similarities or historical cultural similarities. So this is an interesting case of not just Russian expansionism and the invasion of sovereign territory in the Ukraine, but also what we call irredentism. Now, it's not just in the Ukraine. Our focus shifts up north here as Russia has continued to attempt to expand in the Arctic Circle. So many years ago, the United Nations determined who had which territories in the Arctic Circle. There was this thing called UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea. And what it says is that each country in the Arctic has up to 200 miles from their nearest coast. So the nearest bit of land, 200 miles from there, that is your territory. And since 1999, really before then, but over the last couple decades, we've seen more and more ice melt causing countries to make claims to these Arctic waters that aren't necessarily legally established yet. And Russia went so far as to, in 2007, plant a Russian flag underneath the North Pole on the Arctic floor, underneath the ice. And so the question becomes, why does anyone want this cold, frigid territory so much? Well, believe it or not, there are lots and lots of valuable resources in the Arctic. Things like oil, gas, rare earth metals, all kinds of stuff that could bring in trillions and trillions of dollars to a country's economy. So there are many reasons a country might want to lay claim to these territories. You can see here the Arctic Circle with the different countries that actually have Arctic territory. The United States, Canada, Denmark by way of Greenland, Norway, and then Russia. Now, Russia has most of the coastline throughout the Arctic Circle, but here's what UNCLOS says. These countries have up until this red dotted line. That's how far their territory expands. Russia, on the other hand, has laid claim to all of the territory you see here with the diagonal lines. Even though legally they only have up to this red dotted line here, they've laid claim to all of this territory. And much of that is due to resources. Also, trade. There are many ships that come through the Arctic Circle to go trade in various parts of the world, and if you control those trade routes, that can be a very powerful position for a country to be in. This is geopolitics at play. This is political geography in one of its most important forms. Now, how do you back that up? How do you defend that influence? Usually, it's through the military. And what we're seeing here is a map of all of these bases, military bases, for Russia and the rest of the Arctic countries. And if you total all these up, what you'll see is that all of the Russian Arctic bases total up to 18, and the other countries collectively, 12. So these other countries, the United States, Canada, Denmark, and Norway, are all part of NATO, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is what we call a supranational organization. A supranational organization is when 3 or more countries come together for a collective goal, a collective effort. And in this case, it's for military defense. So, for example, here's Norway's territory. If Norway, which butts up against Russia, was to come into conflict with Russia through, say, warfare, military conflict, we would be obligated through NATO to potentially step in and defend them. So many feel that this is sort of a hot spot in the world, and because of the resources at play, countries are really building up their military power in the Arctic Circle. And it's not just these NATO countries like the United States, and you can see one of our Arctic bases up here with some of our friendly nations, but also Russia. And you can see here what one of the Russian Arctic bases looks like. And they have been pouring billions and billions of dollars into this infrastructure, much like you see here in the Arctic, to establish that influence and protect their interest in this part of the world. So, what I'm going to ask that you do is take a look at this very brief clip from the Wall Street Journal. It's only 6 minutes long, and it shows the interests and the actions of 3 countries in the Arctic. One is Russia, and this is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia here on the left. One is the United States, and you can see Trump there in the middle. And then one is China, and this is the general chairman of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping. And you might wonder, what does China have to do with this? Well, watch the video and you will find out. And be sure to answer the 10 questions that go with this video in Buzz. The first 8 questions, I believe 7 or 8, are right in order from the beginning of the video up through the end. And then the last couple questions, you have to sort of reason through on your own. So watch that video, answer those questions. If you get any wrong, you can retake it. So do that as many times as you need to get that 100% locked in. And we will move on with section 6.1 when we continue the notes later in the week. So that's it for this section today. Go ahead and take a look at that video and finish that up. And that's it. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'll see you next time for section 6.1.